Welcome to Historically Modern's December holiday special. We are so excited to have you join us. In lieu of an article this month, our team has come together to create this podcast episode that will explore the very broad themes of being a young woman in academia. Before we get into this episode, Historically Modern would just like to thank everyone for all the love and passion that our readers and followers share with us every month. As a volunteer-based project, we really couldn't do it without all of you, our community. This holiday season, we want to make sure that you know how grateful we are for your support. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Now on to the episode. Hi, I'm Marienza, the founder and editor-in-chief of Historically Modern, and I'm so pleased and excited to sit down with two special guests today to talk all things history, academia, and girlhood. Our first guest, you've already read her article this past October on the horrification of indigeneity in horror movies. Sarah Perry is a recent MA graduate and a first-year PhD student at McMaster University out here in Hamilton, Ontario. And our second guest, you haven't had the pleasure to meet her yet, but her name is Cali Harris, a second-year PhD student at McMaster University who studies apocalyptic symbolism in Tudor England. It's so nice to have both of you here with us. This is the second take of this podcast. So hopefully this one records much better. But we've just been sitting here talking for a while, just about all things history and kind of where we sit as historians in this field. It's such a big field and there's so much to do in it. And so I think we're just going to chat for a while and have you guys join us on this roundtable discussion. So we have to start with the question that every single historian gets asked all the time, especially history students. Why study history, and what kind of drew you to this field, and why do you keep loving it? Because it is such a daunting field at times.
So my journey to history actually starts a long time ago. I'm gonna take it back to grade 8 for you guys. But before grade 8, I always found ancient civilizations, mythology super interesting, but only kind of as a passion. It was never something I really wanted to do. And then in grade 8, when I was graduating my elementary school, I won the history award. And I think it was that where I was kind of maybe I'm good at this. Maybe there's something here. It was kind of out of the blue. I really wasn't expecting to win it. And then I did. And it was kind of oh, okay, interesting. So I took a bunch of history courses in high school. Again, mostly ancient civilization history, the Renaissance, etc. And so that happened, but I applied to university for law. I wanted to go to law school. I wanted to be a lawyer. And the programs I got accepted to were all for law. And so because McMaster has a first-year general degree, you don't choose your major until second year. So I started my first year and very quickly realized that I didn't have the stomach for law the way I thought I did. And so at that point, I didn't really know what to do because, like I said, that was, kind of my end goal. I thought I was going to go to law school. And so one day I was cleaning, I want to say it was in the winter, I was winter cleaning or something, and I came across that certificate that I won, the history award in grade 8, and I came across while I was cleaning, and I kind of just stopped and sat for a second, and I was oh, maybe I was meant to find this, maybe this is what it was meant to do. And so, after a couple of days of thinking, I enrolled in the required history course that you have to take to be able to go into your major at Mac. I got into the major. I ended up doing a combined major between history and peace studies, which is global peace. And it was through that I just fell in love, and now I'm here.
I think for myself as well, Sarah sort of started in grade 8 in childhood, and I'm going to start at the same sort of place too. I think, from a young age, I also had an interest in mythology and, read books like Percy Jackson and those sorts of stories that got me interested in mythological creatures and ancient civilizations. And I have a memory of being 8 years old and going to the Tutankhamun exhibit. And for me, that was just the most incredible thing to see, the mummy, of course, but also just to see mundane or seemingly mundane artifacts, things like amulets and pottery shards and coins and all of these sorts of things that gave an illusion of a life that I knew I could never access or could never see or be a part of. And I think that's something that's really driven the research that I continue to do. Unfortunately, I'm not doing ancient civilizations, but I in my undergrad started in classics and then sort of moved up through time over the course of my undergrad, went from classics to medieval studies and then medieval studies to what I'm doing now, which is in the 16th century. But for me, that idea of mythology or religion or trying to understand the stories that drive people or, that people make sense of their lives through has always been a theme that I've been interested in. And I think just this sort of basic idea that Marienza is doing quite well with her project as well is this idea of storytelling. And just, regardless of what location we're at, what time period we're in, this idea that there are stories around us and there are things that, looking through artifacts or monographs or documents, what can we make sense of and how can we make sense of these lives? And I think for me, that really begins with mythology, and that, sort of interest continues to drive me to this day.
You both kind of started in this interdisciplinary world. Sarah, you did global peace and social justice, and Kelly, you did classics. And so coming together with that, where do you find that interdisciplinary studies fit within history? Because I know that a lot of people in the history department as historians find it difficult to kind of branch into interdisciplinary studies, just because history for the longest time has kind of been closed off to that. So where do you guys find the importance of intertwining interdisciplinary studies into your fields?
Yeah, I think, you mentioned even in your question, this idea that a lot of historians are sort of closed off to the idea of interdisciplinary studies. And that's been the case for a long time. I think this idea that, as historians, we're doing empirical history, we're studying economic records or war or military or things that feel very measurable and empirical. And, in the 20th century, certainly we see a shift in the methods and the ways in which we're going about history. And I think for both Sarah and I, we've picked up a lot of those threads in the way that we approach our history. I know in what I do, because I'm studying religion through a symbolic lens, I'm deeply invested in art methodologies, semiotics, like looking at language and linguistics, and even things like printing. Like, this is sort of a recent obsession of mine, is looking at printing presses and how they work, and trying to understand, when you're looking at a manuscript, you're not just looking at the context of the texts that are produced, you're looking at the paratext. So things like a title page, a dedication page, a printer's emblem on the inside of the front page. All of these sorts of things are not implicit to the text, but they do tell us a lot about the process and the people and the communities that are involved in printing. And that's, sort of more scientific or more mechanical than the history I usually approach, but it is still part of the broader picture. And I think it reminds us, as historians, we have our niche that we study, but the people who lived it didn't live in that niche. Just because I study the history of religion in the 16th century, the people that I'm studying did more in their lives than religion, which means I need to broaden my framework of study and realize I need an understanding of economics or archaeology or anthropology, or, I need to be able to ground myself in the ways in which people lived beyond just what I'm studying, because it all informs one another. So sort of going at it with that bigger picture mindset has been really useful for grounding my research.
Yeah, I think Callie's spoken to this quite well, and like the role that being interdisciplinary can play in like expanding your research and also finding, new ways to approach it that maybe previous historians haven't. For me personally, because I did peace studies, I learned a lot about environmental protests that were going on in Indigenous communities. As Marienza mentioned before, so I do Indigenous history, environmental history, and how they kind of intersect. And I don't know if I would have approached it that way if I hadn't done peace studies. I liked being in nature, but I never had like a strong passion for like the environment. It was never something I thought I was going to go into, even within history. And so, learning about those protests and all this environmental activism that was happening, it made me want to research the history behind that. And a lot of environmental history that's been done previously focuses a lot on, nature and technological developments and waterways and more mechanical stuff, how kind of you were saying. And so being able to approach it from a more cultural perspective has been super interesting for me. And there's a variety of up-and-coming environmental historians who do focus on that, a lot of who are Indigenous, and it's wonderful to see. But I think, like I said, having that interdisciplinary background allowed me to look at it from a place that environmental history didn't originally stem from. And so I think being able to, bring that into itself, but also bring my personal, interest in like finding those activist parts, and then finding how, culture and folklore and connection play a role in environments. That was something that really spoke to me as well.
Yeah, I think, we talked a little bit about this on our first recording that Marienza joked about, but talking about positionality, and I think this does fit neatly with this interdisciplinary conversation, that we are fundamentally interdisciplinary people. Like Sarah and I both did, as we mentioned, degrees that were joint, and, we both have interests outside of history that inform the history that we do. So I'm wondering, you mentioned walking in nature, or sort of being involved in the environment while also having, an academic interest in the environment. Do you think your research has changed how you go about the world or how you see yourself in relation to what you study now?
Oh my God, absolutely. I always joke about this all the time with my partner and like people around me. And I'm like, I'm not the person I was before I started doing my research. Just location based and, place and space and locations and very important thing in history, especially environmental history. But I focus a lot on the East Coast, so I focus on the Atlantic provinces. And my family's from there. My dad grew up in Newfoundland. My family's from Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. So it's also just given me such an opportunity to go back and visit, my community, my family, my roots. But I think it also made me realize things about myself that I didn't realize, finding that connection, between human and non-human beings and just being in connection with each other and the environment, something that really spoke to me, and I was able to kind of find peace in that. And I don't think I would have found that if it wasn't through my research and learning more about these connections. And there's a lot of microhistories in environmental history, and we were kind of talking about that again on the first take, but I love the idea of a microhistory because I think in the grand scheme of things, there's so many big nationalistic things going on in the world right now. It's hard to lose focus of those little tiny, microscopic moments for a connection, but they're so important. And I think that's what really forms the basis of human connection and non-human connection in society. And I think that's the way I approach my research, but also the way I now live my life. And so I don't think I would have found that if it wasn't for my topic.
Do you find, Kelly, that you also look at the world differently now that you come at it from a different perspective, having been with your research for a while now? Do you think that you see the world a bit differently?
I think I do. And I think, the interesting thing about mythology or art, like as a kid, because I read mythology, I loved going to art galleries or going to museums because I felt like even if I knew nothing about the painting on the wall or the sculpture, if it had a title with Hercules in it or a myth that I knew I could tell a story about it. And I joke to people like I'm the most annoying person to go to a museum with because I'll find something, and it's almost like speaking a different language or speaking a code that these stories and these sort of cultural artifacts and you're able to connect them. And I think I came into this field thinking I already knew a lot. And now I just am constantly reminded of what I don't know. And now I know enough to know what I don't know. And I think it's a different experience now going to a museum or going to an art gallery because I have a surface level understanding of things, but the questions I'm asking and the questions that I find myself compelled by are questions I didn't even think to ask when I was younger or when I was beginning to do this work. Thinking more about, the people behind what's made. It's not just seeing a vase, for instance, and thinking this is a beautiful pattern. It's thinking, where did this pattern come from? Is there a history of trade behind this? Is this, a pattern with a history that perhaps, again, betrays a cultural relationship or a military relationship? That's looking at the production of something and then on the flip side, looking at the reception of it. Asking ourselves, is this a vase that was popular? Is this a design that was common? Is this, something that's on display because it's a representation of the everyman, or is this something that's on display because it's extraordinary? And just sort of looking at things from a different perspective and asking those questions that I didn't really have the grounding or the scaffolding historically to ask previously has been really rewarding and I think also deeply humbling. Like I think you both would agree with this. The more you read, the more you're aware of everything else that's out there. And, it seems like every time I read a book, I have another list of 20 or 30 things that I need to be looking up after that. But that is in itself a rewarding process, just, learning all there is to learn in your field. And even if you might not get to it all, it's nice to have an understanding and build yourself sort of that scaffolding of your field.
Yeah, that's amazing. I absolutely agree with that. Definitely every time I open a book, I have highlighted, what does this mean? What do I need to...
a keyword of okay, now I gotta Google.
Yes, and I think every time you read a book, kind of further informs your positionality and kind of has the ability to sway your position. When it comes to perspective and doing your research, historians, we'd love to yap about methodologies, which basically a methodology is just the approach that you take towards your research question. So which kind of angle you're coming after. So a perspective of gender, for example, is a methodology. So what are the methodologies that you guys find that you resonate the most with within your research?
So one that I've kind of started engaging in a lot more, especially as my research has progressed during my PhD, I've done a lot of story work and storytelling. And that is an Indigenous-based research methodology. I've mentioned before I do Indigenous and environmental research. My father has Indigenous heritage on his side, so, it is a little bit of a lived experience for me, a learned experience. But basically, story work and storytelling is this idea of, bringing the past and bringing it into the present. And I will never be able to put it as eloquently as, some Indigenous historians who've done this for years explain it. And there's so many, wonderful historians who talk about it. Sean Wilson's the first one that comes to mind. But it's this idea of, being in partnership, being in ceremony with the stories that you're telling and letting these historical actors that you're looking at live through you. And their stories being told through you instead of, I'm presenting my work, I'm presenting my research. Instead, it's more of a partnership, like I said. And I think that helps me keeps me grounded and keeps me, invested, but not on too much of a personal thing, but also helps me to remember why I'm doing this. And so story work, I think, is such a beautiful thing. And it's really helped me, shape my own research, but also, look at the stories that I'm trying to tell in a different light. And it's helped me also, gain a newfound respect for the stories that I look at.
Yeah, I think for myself, the most obvious one, because I'm looking at symbols, is, trying to integrate art history methodologies. And, I'm not coming at this from the perspective of being an art historian. As much as like I said, love to go to a museum or an art gallery, I'm fundamentally not an art historian. So there is an awareness that I need to have when I'm looking at symbols of trying to approach things not through an anachronistic or presentist mindset. And I think the best way that I try to go about that is just having an awareness of the iconography and the research that's already been done. I'm working on a field that, the historiography for my field really begins in the 16th century. So it's not a new field. There's a lot of work being done that's unique and really impressive, but it's not a field that's changed a ton in the past decades. So for me, looking through art, looking at symbols, it's really important to engage in comparison and trying, when I'm looking at, say, the symbol of the lamb or another apocalyptic symbol, I'm comparing Protestant and Catholic representations of that symbol. I'm comparing representations in rural and more elite documents. I'm looking at England and I'm looking at the continent. Like there's I guess, fundamentally comparative ways to go about that so that I'm not becoming insular. And I'm really aware of that sort of danger of becoming too isolated in my research, that I start to convince myself just because I'm seeing this lamb used in one particular way, that's the only way in which it can be used. So I'm trying to keep a very wide mindset. And I'm also trying to remind myself that, these images, they might have meanings or understandings that are not ever going to be accessible to me as someone living in the 21st century. And that's a hard thing to get on board with, and it's an uncomfortable feeling to sit with. But it is a reality, I think, for a lot of historians who study the early modern period or earlier, that there are cultural meanings or social functions of these images that we simply are not going to be able to access just based on our temporal distance from the period. So, being aware of that possibility and being open to the idea that in many cases for societies that are largely illiterate or, I tend to look from below, so at more ordinary populations, they are using symbols that are inherited from a medieval past. They're using symbols that are deeply, deeply filled with meaning. This whole sort of secondary discourse underscoring society is this discourse of images, and just trying to remind myself that, this is sophisticated in a way that I, as a 21st century person, might not be privy to, and trying to have respect for the symbols and sort of meet them on their own turf, I think is really important.
I think you make such a good point. I think that's something historians struggle with a lot, is not interpreting the stuff that we're looking at in a modern context. Because I think it's so easy to, misinterpret or even condemn things that we're looking at in the past. Being like, how did this happen? How did we get here? What does this mean? But like you said, it's the importance of remembering, like, this is not in the context that we are living in. It's so far removed from us that we have to be able to approach it, like, in the way that it might have been interpreted at the time. Sometimes we won't have that chance to. You also mentioned, like, being, not too isolated in your research. How do you think you kind of go about making sure that doesn't happen to you?
I think the most important part is just to center humanity. And I brought up earlier sort of constantly reminding myself I'm a historian, I'm doing the work of a historian. I'm not, making a grand story or a meta-narrative or, telling a big tale about what happened just to tell something entertaining or tell something that will resonate with people. I'm trying to report on the facts of the situation. And, obviously as historians, we like to write a narrative that's entertaining and that will sell. But at the end of the day, you need to be being true to the subjects of the study. And I do often find myself caught up in the methodology. And, there's a big trend in my field right now and in many other fields of doing history from below and, trying to center the experience of the ordinary man. Which is great and, helps to ascribe a lot of agency to people who have traditionally been overlooked. The problem with that approach at times is that we lose an awareness of the historical reality and we tend to over-assert what that agency looked like. So for instance, in my period, if you're looking at a laborer or a farmer, it's beneficial to say, they had agency, they could participate at times in a political arena. They might not be part of that traditional elite who would be in parliament or establishing legislature, but they do still have a political voice. However, the problem with that is if you push that too far, you're now telling a story that, a farmer, because of their agency, has the same sort of political mobility as a member of the gentry or a member of the elite. And at that point, you've gone sort of too far with this methodological experiment that you've ended up distorting the history. So I think that's something that I try to keep in mind as well, that I, as someone who enjoys media studies and enjoys sort of more cultural studies, methodologies, I would love to come at this as a post-structuralist or come at this from a place that feels new and contemporary. But I also have to sort of scale myself back and realize, you can't necessarily bring those 21st century ideas into the 16th century because then I'm distorting the history. And it's finding that balance between ascribing agency to people who have been denied it historiographically and also being aware of the historical reality and not over ascribing social roles to people who might not in actuality have had them.
I think that's such an important point. I love that you mentioned too, giving people agency who may not had it. I love to do that. I love to, like I said, I like to let the stories that I look up tell their story through me. But like you said, you're walking a line that becomes very easy to distort that history, especially, because historians, at times we have to do a lot of interpretation just because, there's a lack of physical evidence. And I think it can become very easy to assume things, to take on personas, to take on histories for ourselves. And it's a very important thing to make sure that we are representing the histories as they're meant to be, not in a way that we're perceiving them and not presenting them to the world. And that's become a very problematic thing that's even happened in Indigenous history too. There's been a lot of non-Indigenous historians who approach Indigenous history and say, I think this is the way it happens, I'm going to tell it this way. And a lot of it's wrong. And some of that just, stem back to there's a lot of Indigenous cultural context that can't be accurately translated into Western history. But even outside of Indigenous history, there is this problem, like you said, that we have to be very careful to not take on these histories as our own and present them in a way that does justice to the historians and the historical actors that we're working with.
Yeah, I know, one of the books that I read in an Indigenous studies class a couple years ago was Susan Hill. And I think she does a really good job of saying, I'm approaching Indigenous history through fundamentally Indigenous epistemologies. Like she starts her chapters by, recounting or giving examples of oral histories and telling stories. And, the subjects of her study are deeply integrated to the methodologies, of her study. And it results in a study that feels very grounded in what she's doing, that, she's really making an effort to come at the subject of her study in a way that would feel familiar to them. And I think that idea of familiarity can be challenging the further that we go back, and I find myself questioning, am I using words or terms or ways of seeing that would not be familiar to someone in 1530 or 1555? And if I were to go back and hand them my dissertation, if it ever gets written, are they going to look at it and say, that's not my experience, I don't see myself in it? And I think, this conversation that we have often about empathy and the role of historians and empathy is a big part of that. I'm wondering, for what you study, what types of sources do you find yourself drawn to, and how do you keep that idea of empathy in mind and trying not to, bring your ego into the research that you do?
I love oral histories. I think they're so powerful. I think there's nothing more crucial, nothing more potent than an oral history, like a testimony of lived experience. And it helps me. I used to say this to my students last year when I was a teaching assistant, but I would say that there's nothing more powerful than lived experience. You can have every degree in the world, you can have read every book, and you will be, the most qualified person to speak about it, but you'll never have more information on it than someone who's lived it. And I think oral histories really, really encompasses that for me. And so I absolutely love reading. I love, hearing oral testimonies. And a lot of that is storytelling. I think maybe that's why I'm drawn to it so much. And I think also too, again, it's very easy to become wrapped up in these sensationalized stories. And again, finding those, very simple ones that might have been hidden before, again, helps you put into perspective instead of looking at this dominant, nationalistic narrative, finding that, some things might have been overlooked. And I think it helps you balance that and kind of find the truth somewhere in between.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that connects the three of us, because we all study very, very different histories, is that we all in some way look at people.
Yeah. And
we all look at people who are not at the top of this historical food chain. And I think that allows us to have add a depth of understanding to the very big historiography that is history. And I think that one thing that we all kind of also do is empathetic work, where we try to walk this line between bias and empathy. And like you said, Cali, try to present the real history that comes from it without straying too far beyond what that truth actually is. And I feel like some of the people that I look at within my history are still alive. A lot of them are still alive. And it always kind of makes me nervous to over assume something or to misinterpret something, because these people could read my work. I don't know why they would, but they could at one point read my work and be like, that's not anything that I experienced. And so I think that as historians, we have this weird position that we're in where we need to interpret, because like you said, Sarah, there are gaps and there needs to be interpretation, but then you don't want to misinterpret. So how do you guys find that you kind of walk that line of trying to be both a people pleaser and bring the truth to history?
I think for me, I had to stop being a people pleaser. I know that sounds really controversial. It's you still, at the end of the day, you have to bump elbows, you have to be professional. But I think I stopped trying to be a people pleaser. There's going to be some narratives that my history is going to have to tell that people aren't going to like. And it's not going to be common, and it's not going to be, people are not going to be ecstatic about it. But I wouldn't be doing service to my history if I didn't ruffle a few feathers. And I think that's the reason that good historical scholarship works, is when you have those critiques, you have those challenges, you have those, but that's actually not how I think it happened. This is how I think happened. And again, obviously not interpreting too far where you're distorting the narrative, but I think, for lack of a better word, I had to stop giving a shit about what people thought. And that's going to be something that's going to be really hard for a lot of young historians to overcome, especially ones who are women like us, because, when you start out in your undergrad, you get told, do it like this, follow what professors are saying, follow the instructions, you'll be fine. And then you get to upper levels and you're like, I have a say in this, I can do the way I want to do. And I remember starting my comps this year, and I was talking to another first year PhD student about it. For people listening, comps is comprehensive readings. And we went into our comprehensive meetings with, pages and pages and pages of notes about methodology and epistemologies and things to pull out and quotes and everything. And we sat down with our supervisors and they were like, well, how did you feel? And we were like, how did we feel? We're not supposed to know how we felt. Here's the evidence on page 67 if you want to go back to it. But they're like, no, but how did you feel? And I think being able to, again, reclaim that agency for yourself as a historian and as a human, while still honoring those agencies that your historical actors have and having empathy for that. It's a process you have to walk and a process you have to learn. And it's going to be kind of messy, but it's so empowering.
I think too, for the work that Marienza and Sarah do, the idea of accountability is a little more obvious and a little easier to articulate. I'm not saying it's easy to do as historians, but you're both saying you're working with subjects who in many cases are still alive or have ancestors that are still within living memory. You're able to see evidence or hear oral testimonies from people who are, involved in the history or who are at least associated and have a stake in how that history is told. And for myself, that connection with accountability, because I do study the 16th century, is not as obvious, but it doesn't mean that it's not there. And I think that's an important thing to remember as we, start looking at histories that are older and, let's say 18th century, that, in many cases, there's not living memory for these things. I'm lucky to have a lot of documents because I do church history, but it's still not something that, I'm ever really going to meet these people or really ever have to defend my work or defend my arguments in the same way that the girls sitting here are going to have to. And I think at times that means, historians in my position feel as though they don't have to be as politically aware or as accountable to what they're studying, because there's this sense that it was 500 years ago, do your best to be correct and be empirical and be truthful, but hey, no one's going to come and correct you if you get something wrong, which I think is a dangerous opinion. Like at the end of the day, we're all doing history because we have an interest and a stake in humanity, and because we have an interest in presenting history and exploring ways of life that are foreign to us, but are still, resonant and familiar as humans. And I think, even if I don't have to defend myself in a political way or in an accountable way in the same way that Marienza and Sarah do, I still do have an interest in representing people 500 years ago in the same way that, if someone 500 years from now was listening to this podcast, I would want them to do their due diligence with their research. I would want them to bring the historical empathy and all these other pieces that we're talking about to the conversation. So for me, it's really just important to keep in mind that idea of accountability. And even if I'm not, immediately accountable to the people that I'm studying, I do try to keep in mind that human connection and just sort of, hold myself accountable as a historian to say that, you need to be producing a history or telling a history that is familiar to the people that you're studying. And that is something that, is resonant with them and is something that is still centering their voices and is not just about my ego as a historian or trying to do something subversive just to make a name for myself. Like, there is a hard line to walk between career and research, but I think most of us try to keep that idea of research really close to our hearts and keep that idea of accountability close as well.
Something I like to remember too is that I like to keep you talk a lot about accountability, I think that's so important. And another one I really like to remember is accessibility. And I think that's something that often gets overlooked, especially in academia, because it's very easy to do your research and write a good paper that's going to be accepted by other scholars and other historians. And of course that is why you do your work, but I also want my work to be applicable to the everyday person who's like, hey, I want to learn about this history I never learned about before. And I think that's, at times why history seems so boring and so closed off to people, because it's not accessible. And we write it for other people in academia, we write it for other scholars, but we don't write it for the everyday person. And I think a part of that is having accountability for who is your research accessible to. It's like you said, if you went back in time and handed your dissertation to the people that you're writing about, would they understand it? And I think a way too that does apply to the everyday person, like, is the histories that you're writing and the work that you're writing, is that going to be understandable to, just the person that wants to learn more about this, more about that, not someone who, has 10,000 degrees and qualifications. Of course, that's amazing, but it's important that everybody understands it,
That was huge for me. And I think that was the main motivation behind starting Historically Modern, was the people that I study, a lot of the times education was not accessible to them, even though they were, in the 1960s. And yes, there were people like, for example, in the Tenderloin district that I study, who did go to school because they were still white men and perhaps could be closeted or still came from perhaps like wealthier families and had that accessibility. But a lot of people, especially like outwardly trans people or people who presented different or were out, didn't have that same accessibility to my position right now, where I'm in this higher educational system and looking down at them as subjects of study. I never wanted it to feel that way. I never wanted it to feel like I was part of this institution that they were never able to have access to. And so Historically Modern was definitely a passion project to bring the research that you two are doing and that other people in the graduate programs are doing, because there is such a barrier between the way that we write. And that was the big thing when I connect with contributors and collaborators that we're going to have in upcoming months is they always ask, how am I supposed to sound? Because all the papers that we write are so formalized and they're for academics. And I'm always like, you can use contractions. I was like,
I love a contraction.
You can put in an anecdote. My article starts with an anecdote because we never get to really do that in our field of work, but that doesn't make the research that we do less real or less valid just because we used the I pronoun, you know?
I was going to say, you know what was so huge for me, first person? Being able to, like, say, I think this, crazy, actually groundbreaking for me, because you go up, like, you learn through high school, you learn through, like, the first, you know, undergrad years, third person. And then when someone goes, you can use I, you're like, again, I can have an opinion on this. Groundbreaking.
And I think, too, it speaks to a broader conversation that we were having earlier, which is this bias problem that, you know, to teach undergrads not to write with bias, the easiest way to do that is to say, don't use the word I. Yeah. Take yourself out of it. Therefore, you know, ideally, you'll avoid any bias or presentism in your work. The problem is, as we know now, like, you taking yourself out of it is not always the best way to do it, because now you don't have that accountability and that empathy that we're saying is so important. Yeah. And I think for a lot of us, being able to reclaim the personal pronouns once you get to a grad program feels like a big step, because not only are you know, you feel more entitled to that opinion because you're saying, I believe, I will argue, you know, I contest, etc. But it also means you're allowed to bring some of that empathy back in. And obviously we're still trying to avoid the bias that comes with, you know, starting with your ego and you know, going from there. But I do think it's one of those small things that feels really rewarding to be able to say, you know, I'm aware of my positionality, I'm aware of how I'm situated within this research, and I am presenting my own opinion. I'm accountable for my own ideas in a way that's saying, this paper will argue doesn't really get at.
I think too, it's like you said, it's you know, a learned practice being able to avoid that bias and arrogance, but also being able to situate yourself in your work. You know, some of the best papers I've ever read is when I can see the author in their work, when I can see the way you write, the way you think about things, the way your mind works, even if you're not, again, having this bias and this, I'm all knowing because I do this work, and having that accountability, seeing someone in their work and seeing that personality shine through is so beautiful to me, and I think it's so important. I think a lot of academia is very, very scientific and very devoid of, again, emotion and empathy and humanity. And we have to remember that we work in the humanities, so you're never going to be able to fully take out the human out of a paper. And, you know, again, it's a learned process being able to balance that difference between, you know, personality and arrogance and bias, but it's such an important skill to have.
So I just want to ask, because we're all women in history, and that comes with its own kind of pressures, I think. And I know Sarah and I talk a lot about imposter syndrome and feeling like you don't know your place within history and academia, because a lot of the times the sources that we're reading are produced by men. So what do you guys feel is your position on that kind of? How do you feel within your situation right now as women in academia, and that imposter syndrome, and kind of shrugging that off and letting that fall away so that you can do your work? Because at the end of the day, your gender has nothing to do with the quality of work that you produce.
Yeah, I think, you know, because a lot of the sources I read, I mean, my field is, there are a lot of women who do this history, but in terms of the sources that I'm reading and the primary documents that I'm looking at are 98% written by men, especially because I'm looking at church records and church documents. I mean, these are, in many cases, elite men or theologians or educated men. For images, again, most of the printers, because this is a professional position, are men as well. So I often don't have access to women's voices, and I'm not working on a project that's taking gender as a lens. So it's not something, gender's not something that's really in front of me. It's not obvious to me when I'm researching. But I am often aware of my own positionality because I'm reading people like Martin Luther. And I don't know if you've ever read Martin Luther, but his position on women is not great. I'll leave it at that. But it can be hard sometimes to be reading people who in many ways feel progressive and feel modern in the ideas that they're advocating for, and then hitting one of those sentences about the role of women or you know, these sort of traditional accounts, and it really makes you step back and realize, hey, you know, this is a completely different worldview. And, you know, a lot of historians like to use the quote, the past is a foreign country. And this idea that you're not only looking at something that is, you know, 500, 600 years old, you're looking at some place in which the customs and the ways of life and the ways of orienting oneself are, in many cases, quite different and quite distinct from how we go about the world today, in ways that we might not always realize or might not always know until we're brushing up against them. So I think, you know, again, I'm talking a lot about empathy on this podcast, but I think that's a really important idea that I don't have to agree with Luther. I don't have to feel comfortable reading Luther. And I think that feeling of unsettlement is actually where a lot of really good research is done, is reading something and saying like, hey, this is brushing up against my sensibilities. I'm not going to say this is wrong because that's anachronistic, but I am going to use that to make a broader point about what's unique about an early modern sensibility. And, brushing up against things that feel uncomfortable or feel foreign to me do actually help me to get a sense of why this period is unique, or what transformations in terms of culture or society are occurring in this period that are distinct from a modern time. So I do think it's beneficial to, as a historian, feel uncomfortable or feel unsettled, because that really signals to you, I think, that there's something worth doing here. There's something worth investigating further.
I think that's such a good point you make too, especially about this not agreeing ideology. And I feel like the first time that you go to read something, you disagree with it, you feel like you're wrong, because you're like, this was assigned to me by a professor, this was assigned on a syllabus. If I don't agree with this take, I'm clearly not understanding it. And I think that's something that a lot of young, especially women in history, have to come to terms with, that just because you disagree, you have to go about it eloquently, you have to go about it professionally, but that doesn't make you wrong here, just because you're not agreeing with it. And I think that was something myself, personally, I had to come to terms with, was rejecting this notion that everything I'm going to read is something I'm going to agree with, and that me forming my own opinions is not me misunderstanding the literature. It's just having a different take on it. And it is, like you said, Cali, when you're feeling uncomfortable, that's when the most learning happens. And being comfortable with that is going to be a process. It's going to be something that you're not going to learn right away. I remember, being 17 and reading something and being like, what happens if I don't understand this? Oh my God. Or, my first time in my master's degree, really, really disagreeing with a scholar. And it's really intimidating too when the scholars are still alive, because they're like, they could see what I write and they could comment on me disagreeing. And I think coming to terms with that, that's part of academia, is contrasting opinions, and that's how we learn and that's how we grow from one another. Again, respectfully and having that dialogue, but that's something that's important to have.
Yeah, I think that especially women and also young people who are entering academia kind of experience that moment of, I don't know anything, I shouldn't have a say because I don't know, I'm new to this. And especially when they're faced with a reading or something that they don't agree with, or perhaps a lecture from a professor that they have opinions about, is feeling that feeling of, I can't say anything because I seriously have no idea what I'm doing. And then half the time you do actually have a pretty sound, valid comment to make, but it's definitely trying to get over that hurdle. And I feel like the last question to kind of wrap things up for today is, where do historians kind of fit into this modern conversation as the world moves forward? The world is definitely perhaps not an uplifting place at the moment, especially on the Western side in North America. But we all belong in a broader conversation, and I just want to know where you feel like a historian, especially a young historian, kind of fits into that conversation.
That's so funny that you asked that. I was at a round table at McMaster the other week that we hosted on what is Canadian history good for? And obviously this, encompasses all history entirely, not just Canadian history. But we had this hour-long discussion, and at the end of it, everyone kind of came to terms with where did we even go from here? What happened? And something that I had said during the roundtable, I'm going to say it again, was that I think as historians we find meaning in the past, we find meaning in the work we do, but I don't know if that meaning is, I don't think you can homogenize that meaning. Mm-hmm. And I think every historian is going to have a different, unique meaning for what they do. They're going to have different reasons to justify it. We're going to have different places, and we're going to have different purposes in the world that we're all just kind of discovering together. But I think that's the beauty of it. And I think we do history a disservice by saying, as historians, this is we do what we do. We do it because we do it for our history, our personal history we do. And I think that is the most important thing.
I think too, for what I do, it's older, and I get conversations or comments from people often saying, what's the point of doing this? These people are dead. This is 500 years old. What's the purpose of still, centering this history and dedicating your life to people you'll never meet or people who will never thank you for doing this history? And I think, just as Sarah said, I study religious history. I'm not particularly religious, but I do believe in this idea of revelation and this idea of having, a human spirit and recognizing, people who feel familiar, and, this idea that even if someone's 500 years old and the past is a foreign country and all of these ideas that help us to ground what we're studying, there is still, a connection that we have as humans. And I think that's really important to honor that and center that in what I do.
Well, thank you guys so much for sitting down with me. We reached the end of our time with our guests and their busy schedules, so I'm definitely going to send them off. I would love to thank you, Sarah and Cali, for sitting down with us. I'd also like to take a moment to thank McMaster's Line's New Media Center for allowing us to record this podcast in their space. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. Thank you and have a great holiday season.